Part 4. Chapter 14. Hate the Game. "I've got 3 ships on sensors," Skip reported. Corey and Steve were in the common area looking over the terrain details Baxter had been sending. The ship's SI added, "Looks like about 10 minutes out." Corey looked at the ceiling. "How far are Jax and Naomi?" "Maybe 15, 20 at the most. Their skimmers don't have very sophisticated computers. They're not on my passive scopes yet." Steve looked at the ceiling. "And those transports?" Baxter answered, "They made their drops and headed out. Both are parked about 2 kilometers from the back of this valley. I've got eyes on one of the strike teams. The other was moving west when I lost visual. Both teams are well armed." Skip added, "I was able to pick them up sporadically." The main entertainment screen updated with an aerial rendering of the valley and surrounding terrain, out to 5 kilometers. The 2 transports were red squares. The 2 attack teams were red rectangles. The inbound craft were red circles. The Osprey was a green circle. Baxter was a green triangle. "Lots of red," Steve observed. "Yeah, but they don't have me," the combat droid huffed, certain of his abilities. "Let's hope," Corey said. "Jax, Naomi, we've got inbound," Skip said over the shared comm channel. "Sitrep?" Jax asked. "Corey and Steve are prepping now in the armory. Baxter is on walkabout. The 2 strike teams are in place. Baxter is shadowing one of them. I've got the other on tactical, but we don't have weapons on them." "Copy that." He consulted the small computer display in front of him. "These things have pretty shitty nav software, but I think we're about 15 out. They're fast, but not that fast." "The inbounds will be skids down in just under 10, the ship's SI replied. Jax pushed the throttle on his skimmer all the way to the stops. Several indicators lit up. On the small display, a warning appeared showing that prolonged use of the throttle at full power may damage the craft and cause a forfeiture of any security deposit. Jax saw Naomi's skimmer follow suit, keeping pace with his own. From her skimmer, Naomi asked, "So, is there a plan for when we get there?" Jax smiled to himself. "I'm sure something will come to one of us." Naomi groaned and reached out to the small console in front of her, tattoos glowing around her face and hand. The small display in front of her blinked, then went to the familiar scrolling code mode. "The lead freighter is hailing us," Skip announced. Corey and Steve had moved to the bridge for a better view of the situation. Corey smoothed her hair back, tightening the piece of cloth that held it in place. She looked at the communication screen mounted from the ceiling and nodded. The screen came to life, filled with the face of a stern woman of Asian descent. "We are here for our goods." "Hello to you too," Corey smiled. "We're finalizing a few things. If you can give us a few minutes." "We'll be landing in 2 minutes. Our representative will meet you at the nearest set of modules to your ship." The screen went black. Steve looked at her. "That went well." She shrugged. "Well, we already know they're planning to kill us, so—" She looked at the ceiling. "Baxter, get ready." "Always am," the combat droid replied. The 2 humans headed for the staircase. Corey stopped at Rudy's station. "Keep Jax and Naomi informed." The droid's head made a full rotation, his optic sensor spinning. "Will do. Be careful." Corey patted the small droid on the head as she passed. As Steve and Corey exited the Osprey, Corey pointed past the mouth of the small valley they'd parked in. "There." In the distance, 2 heavy lift freighters were rumbling their way to the ground, their powerful lift engines churning up a minor dust storm. The third was hovering over them in an overwatch position. "Reassuring," Steve murmured, nodding toward the hovering vessel. A hatch on the nearest chip opened, and 3 people emerged. Corey and Steve walked toward the trio, stopping at the agreed-upon ore module. "Hi," Steve waved as the trio approached. "Hello," the lead man said, bowing. He looked at the large ore modules. "You were successful." He looked Steve up and down. But you are not Jackson Caruso. The other two, a man and a woman in crisp black suits, were staring at Corey and Steve, sizing them up. Corey noticed that the woman was the same one from their earlier conversation. Above the neck of each of their immaculately tailored suits were the barest hints of tattoos. Corey took point. "You're right, Jackson is unavailable at the moment. He asked us to welcome you. He'll be along shortly." She gestured to the set of ore modules nearest them, and the one 100 or so meters away, closer to the two freighters. "As you can see, we've retrieved the 2 train cars' worth of ore, as agreed." The leader of the trio nodded to his associates. One moved to the nearest set of modules, the other headed toward the further set. "And our specified lots are accounted for?" Steve and Corey nodded. This time Steve answered. "Yes, sir. You'll find the designated lots in each set of modules." The man bowed his head. "Excellent work." He looked past Corey and Steve, toward the not-too-distant walls of the valley. Knowing what to look for, Corey spotted the smallest grin form on his lips. He turned and looked first at the nearer of his associates, the woman, who had a handheld scanner in her hand. She nodded. The third of their group had a similar scanner and nodded his confirmation. The leader of the group nodded, then removed his G-phone from his pocket. He smiled at Steve and Corey. "Thank you." He looked down at his phone, thumb poised over something on the screen. Over his shoulder, Corey saw his 2 associates remove pistols from inside their suit jackets. From recessed panels on the hovering freighter, 2 blaster turrets emerged. His thumb twitched toward the G-phone, only to explode in a red mist. Not the player. "Baxter, they're down with the bad guys now. Are you ready?" Skip wirelessly beamed to his companion, hiding in the scrub brush behind a group of almost a dozen armed men and women. "I'm ready." The combat droid beamed back, as his forearms shifted to allow half-meter-long blades to deploy. They clacked as the individual segments locked into place. Once locked into place, energy flowed into them, causing them to glow crimson. Quieter than a mechanical being his size should be able to be, he crept up to within 2 meters of the nearest enemies. "Hello, I am here to kill you," he said, loud enough for the nearest woman to hear before he leapt into the middle of their formation, blades cutting through the light armor they wore like it wasn't there. When he was sure that each target was dead, and that his attack hadn't attracted the attention of the team on the opposite side of the valley, he powered down the blades. In all, he'd killed the entire strike team without a single sound making it to the team across the valley floor hearing. As he moved toward the edge of the valley wall, his dual-shoulder railguns deployed, as did his forearm blasters. He sighted on the man talking to Steve and Corey. As he watched the exchange, he saw the man working his phone, thumb ready to activate something. With no better intel to operate from, the combat droid made a decision. He fired a single shot. The sound of the shot came after the man's hand and G-phone exploded in a red mist. Steve and Corey were nearly to the ground before the Asian man with now only one hand realized what was happening, just before the loud crack echoed through the valley. Baxter's railguns. By the time they hit the ground and shimmied toward a rock barely big enough to provide cover, the wounded man had darted back to the relative safety of his nearest colleague. Blaster fire erupted from the opposite wall of the valley, chewing up the ground around Steve and Corey's small boulder. Rock chips and damp soil pelted them. Steve glanced over his shoulder as energy bolt lanced from one side of the valley wall to the other, Baxter. The weapons fire pinning them down abated as the second team of attackers changed targets to the valley wall opposite them. Shouts echoed down into the valley from above. The freighter opened fire as well, its more powerful energy weapons igniting the grass around the 2 defenders. Steve looked at Corey as she ducked behind their meager cover. "We gotta find someplace less exposed," She nodded. "Incoming!" was shouted over their shared comm channel, causing Corey to flinch. In the distance, 2 small craft zipped in alongside the hovering freighter before diving steeply to make a semi-controlled crash landing. The confusion caused by the 2 inbound skimmers was enough to give Corey and Steve a chance to sprint toward the Osprey. They made it as far as the far side of the ore module before the hovering freighter resumed its firing. The 2 remaining intact members of the initial trio turned their attention to the skimmers, now sitting in deep furrows. Jax and Naomi had ejected just before impact and were crouched next to one of the landed freighters in the shadow of its landing gear. "Weapons would be nice," Jax groaned, rubbing his elbow. His jumpsuit had a rip along one arm, and blood was seeping from a cut below his shoulder. Naomi looked at him and winked. She placed both hands on the hull of the old freighter. Her hands and face lit up. "Damn it," she hissed. "What?" She moved her hands to different parts of the landing gear and hull plating. "Haven't found any live circuits yet. Wait, there," she said, eyes closed. Jax watched impatiently until the same recessed weapons as those on the hovering freighter deployed and took aim at the other landed freighter. She only got a few shots off before Jax pushed her to the ground. The man and woman that had been inspecting the ruins of the skimmers had taken aim at them. The battle near the top of the valley dwindled, leaving both sections of the valley wall smoking and aflame. Large blackened impact craters dotted both sides. Corey and Steve charged out from behind the nearest ore module, blasters blazing. The large man fell to the ground, his shoulder a smoking ruin. The woman turned to engage the armed threats, but only fired a few shots, enough to cause her 2 assailants to drop for cover. She darted to the freighter Naomi was firing on, running up the boarding ramp. Jax looked up and ushered Naomi out from under the freighter they were using for cover, as its lift engines powered up. Whoever was at the controls was in a hurry, as the freighter began to rise before the engines were even at full power. Naomi and Jax were blown to the ground by the powerful energy exhaust. Jax screamed as he rolled several feet, striking his bloodied elbow on a rock. From his position on the ground, he saw Corey and Steve get up and move toward the 2 men they'd incapacitated. At the same time, he saw the Osprey lift off the ground, the small missile launcher ports open on her sides. 2 of the small, highly explosive missiles leapt from their housing and crossed the distance between the Osprey and the hovering freighter in seconds, exploding against its side. The much larger ship lurched to the side, brought its blasters to bear, and opened fire on the smaller Valerian co-op infiltrator. The Osprey tilted and increased altitude as it unleashed another pair of missiles. "Those things aren't cheap," he whispered to himself, as the freighter that was hovering over the battle listed to port, then slammed to the ground, gouging a furrow nearly 50 meters long in the soggy valley floor. The freighter that the woman had boarded moments ago, heedless of anything or anyone around it, engaged its sublight engines. The powerful thrust struck the other freighter, the one Jax and Naomi had been hiding under, forcing it almost back to the ground. One of the landing legs, the one Naomi had touched to hack into the ship systems, hit the ground and bent. It would not be retracting into the hull any time soon. Unlikely backup. As the least damaged freighter climbed, its sister ship, the one it had pushed to the ground earlier, did as well, albeit much slower. Jax watched as the Osprey moved to get clear of the valley walls, as it lobbed 2 more missiles at the nearest freighter. Explosions rocked the ship, but didn't bring it down. The ship returned fire with its blasters, raking the hull of the much smaller ship. Until the Osprey could get above the other ships, she was limited to missiles. The most powerful weapon the infiltrator had, the particle beam cannon, was mounted on the underside of the ship. "Hi," Corey said, as she and Steve reached Jax and Naomi's position, their prisoners in tow. The one-handed man growled when he saw Jax. "You will suffer greatly for this betrayal." In the distance, the sound of engines, lots of them, was building. Ships were inbound. Jax looked at the man, his face serious. "Look, I don't care what you flower power assholes get up to out here on the edge, but you came to me at my home and lied to me." He stepped right up to the man, their chests an inch apart. "Your boss tricked me into robbing mom-and-pop operations, independent operations. That hurts me." He pushed the man away and tapped his chest. "In a special place." He leaned in so that his face was inches from the other man. "Oh, and then you all were going to kill us." He stood and turned away from the man. Jax looked off in the distance at the approaching ships, now very visible and very Imperial. He looked to the one-handed man, then to his friend. The second man's shoulder was a blackened mess of burnt fabric and skin. "I'd give you a message for your boss, but, well, I don't think you'll be seeing him anytime soon." The more damaged freighter, likely seeing it had nowhere to run, turned, bringing its weapons to bear on the small party standing next to the ore module. Steve and Corey registered the danger a split second before Jax and Naomi. Jax was about to swear when a powerful railgun round struck the already damaged freighter. Another, then a fourth round struck the ship. Pieces of the damaged vessel rained down on the valley floor. One of the blaster turrets that a moment ago was about to vaporize Jax and his friends crumpled inward and exploded. Jax saw the smile that had formed on both prisoners' faces fade as they realized that they would almost certainly be arrested alive. The Imperial ships roared overhead, 3 assault shuttles, a full wing of Victory-class starfighters, and a troop transport. The starfighters moved to surround the fleeing freighter. It opened fire, destroying one of the nimble fighters. The remaining 5 opened fire, quickly destroying the weapons systems, then engines, driving the freighter to the ground, where it landed in a crumpled metal heap. The troop transport landed a few hundred meters from Jax and the others. He looked at his friends, making a motion that caused Corey and Steve to toss their pistols to the ground. The side of the transport opened as the heavy assault shuttles circled over the other 2 freighters. 12 shock troops filed out, followed by a young man in a crisp crimson officer's uniform. Jax and the others remained where they were, waiting for the approaching entourage. Once the immediate threat of the fleeing freighter was handled, the fighters moved to encircle the Osprey. Jax watched as the ship gently sat back down on the dirt 200 or so meters away. Rudy, or Skip, both, likely, were playing nice. That was good. Jax hoped that Baxter would remain hidden until this was over. There was already a lot to try to explain. A combat droid with heavy ordnance was not something he wanted to add to the list. The troopers moved to surround the small group, their blaster carbines held at the ready. Naomi looked at Jax, who shrugged. The officer arrived. Jax figured the haughty-looking officer couldn't be much older than him. "Which one of you is in charge?" Jax slowly raised his hand. "I guess that would be me. I'm Jackson Caruso." He hitched his thumb over his shoulder toward the Osprey. "Captain of the Independent Transport, Osprey."